Hi everybody. Now we'll do finally, after a couple of days of missing, we'll do a chapter of The Fields of Home by Ralph Moody. Okay, let's see here. Chapter 20. The screen door bangs. I wonder what that means. I'd never seen a cow that milked any easier than the new one. She didn't lift her foot, even switch her tail. The milk came in wide white ribbons till the froth stood high above the top of a 12-quart pail. Grandfather was almost hugging himself at the good trade he'd made. All through breakfast Saturday morning, he could only talk about how much butter we were going to have next winter, how big a log the steer calves would be able to pull when they were 3 years old. Grandfather was still happy when I went to make the rake stones in the high field. But when I got there, I was sure he'd been there ahead of me. Along the orchard wall, there was a trail where the dew was knocked off the grass. In the soft ground at the end of the last row I'd raked, there were 2 marks of a man's shoes. They were the same size and shape as grandfather's, and were within a foot of the rake. The toe marks were much deeper than the heels, so I knew the man had been squatting down looking at it carefully. If it had been grandfather, I couldn't understand why he hadn't scolded me, or why he'd been so happy at breakfast. Whatever upset him must have been something that came in the mail. I just hauled the load of stones to the orchard wall when grandfather left the beehives, went to meet the mailman, then into the house. I had the drag unloaded, was just straightening up to get the kinks out of my back, when I heard him shouting from the direction of the buildings. That distance I couldn't make out a word he was saying. I could tell he was terribly mad. He was standing by old Nell's head at the corner of the woodshed, seemed to be shaking his fist at the summer kitchen doorway as he shouted. A minute later, Millie stepped into the doorway, but I couldn't make out one word from another. It lasted 3 or 4 minutes. Then grandfather climbed onto the wagon and drove away at a hard trot. When I pulled the next load to the wall, I saw Millie coming up the roadway past the side of the orchard. She had a jug in her hand. From the way she was walking, I knew she was madder than a trapped weasel. She didn't answer when I called, "Hi, Millie," kept her lips pressed tight together till she was right in front of me. Then she held the jug out and snapped, "Fetch you some switchel. Ain't going to stay here another cussed day." She kept right on sputtering while I drank. What does Thomas think I be, a dog to get hollered at every cussed time he makes a bad trade or gets a letter he don't like? So tannish and ugly this morning, old Bess can't even abide him, and he's hid off under the woodshed. I ain't going to stand it another blessed day. "This switchel's pretty good," I told her. "It's cold, and you seem kind of hot. Let's go sit in the shade while the colt rests. I've kept him on the go all morning." "Don't want to sit down. Don't want no switchel. I want to know what's got into Thomas. Sweet as sugar one day and bitter as gall the next." "What's the matter?" I asked her. "Did the brindle cow die?" "Not yet, but she will devilish quick if ever she kicks me again." Oh, poor Millie. Oh, glad I'm not that cow. "What are you trying to milk her for?" I asked. "Her milk won't be any good for 2 or 3 days. Why don't you let the calf suck her?" "Can't suck her. Ain't a teat on her, but it's growed up and watched till the good Lord himself couldn't milk her." "Don't worry about it," I told her. "'Tain't the cow. It's the letters. I want to know what in tuckin' Thomas is up to. Sneaking mail abouts like a lovesick widow woman. Huh, ain't no fool like an old fool." Millie's eyes squinted as he pinched her mouth up tight. "Don't calculate he's been a-writing to the matrimonial papers, do you? Waiting on the mailman, driving to the falls like as if the devil was after him. Ain't you took note he's been a-meeting the noon train? Good Lord of living. I got two minds to one to go off and leave him right this blessed minute. I'll go off to Lewiston and get me a job in the mill." The train whistled 2 long and 2 short blasts for the Lisbon Falls crossing.
Hey, Stephen, slow down.
Oh. The sound came sort of faint and wailing through the woods. Millie jerked one hand up, cupped it around her ear, and said, "Hark, do you mark that? If Thomas thinks you're going to fetch some fat old—" "Oh, you're crazy, Millie," I told her. "Ain't neither," she almost cried. "What's he sneaking around with letters for? Won't he eat my victuals no more? Why does he get so cussed mad when I want to get my kitchen screens up? Levi fetched. I already had the stones cleared off nearly a fifth of the high field. I had plenty of time, so I said, "You go on back to the house and get dinner ready. I like your victuals, and I'll quit for the day as soon as I get the rocks hauled from this last row. It'll take me about an hour. Then I'll make your screens for you this afternoon." Millie was almost running as she went down the hill toward the house. She must have worked at a run after she got there. When I'd finished and taken the yellow coat to the pad, I heard her singing in the kitchen. She'd seen me coming and had dinner all on the table. "There, by gosh," she called when I came into the back pantry. "Let Thomas fetch home his widow woman if he wants to. I ain't going to scratch and pinch penny on the victuals no more for him. I killed a young fryer for dinner. That means a young chicken. And I'm going to kill another one tomorrow. Got a cake in the oven with 3 eggs in it, too. Let his widow woman try baking with 1 egg. By the eternal, I'd like to see how long she'll live on boiled potatoes and sow-belly. Never have nothing fitting to eat, excepting when Levi comes." The only way I could get the idea of a widow out of Millie's head was to talk about the screens. She kept telling me over and over that she wanted a spring strong enough to slam the door shut before half the flies in creation could follow her body inside. With Uncle Levi's having the lumber for the frames all ripped and planed, making the screens wasn't a very big job. As I fitted the corner joints, bored holes, and drove the dowel pins, Millie tacked on the screen wire and the molding. All afternoon she was as nervous and cranky as a setting hen. Every few minutes she'd go to the carriage house door, look out to see if Grandfather was coming. Every time I had to plane a joint over, she'd yap at me for being too particular. We had to take the hinges off the brand bin in the barn, and we used a knob for one of Uncle Levi's bench doors, but at first couldn't find a spring to hold the door shut. It wasn't until we had them all hung I thought of using a thin birch sapling. Grandfather still hadn't come home when we were all finished, and I tended the door while Millie shooed the flies out of the kitchen. "There, by gosh," she said. She stood pulling the door open, letting the bench sapling slam it too. "Bet you Thomas ain't going to leave that door standing half open. Time he was getting home to his victuals." The chores took till way after dark, because the brindle cow was almost impossible to milk. She wouldn't let her twin calves suck. Her teats were so overgrown with warts that I could only get a fine spray of milk from them, and she kicked like an army mule. Millie was holding a fork handle between the brindle's legs so she wouldn't kick me off the stool. I had her about half milked when Grandfather shouted, "Whoa, whoa, Nell," from the barnyard. By the time we got to the front barn door, he'd climbed down from the wagon and started for the house. There was moonlight enough to see that he had his arms loaded with what looked to be crocks and tin pans he'd bought at the auction. After one glance, Millie ran toward him, calling, "Wait, wait, Thomas, I'll open it for you." She was too late. Grandfather's crucible stuck 2 fingers out from under the crock and got hold of the knob on the new screen door. He pulled back a few inches, balanced on one foot, and poked the other one into the crack between the door and the jamb. The next second, he kicked the door halfway open and slammed back against his armload of crocks and pans. For a minute, it sounded as if a hurricane had struck a peddler's wagon. Then Grandfather yelled, "Time and tarnation," so loud he could have been heard at Lisbon Falls. Before Millie could stop him, he'd kicked the screen out of the bottom of the door and yanked it off one hinge. "What in time and tarnation kind of going on is this?" he hollered. "Ain't been no screen doors on this house in 100 years, and ain't going to be none now." Millie was pulling at his arm when I got there, and was yelling till I couldn't make out a word she was trying to say. Grandfather shoved her away, yanked at the door frame again, and shouted at me, "Get it out of here! Get it out, I tell you! Don't let me see no more of your fiddle-faddle contraptions round the place. Won't have it! Won't have it, I tell you!" By that time, Millie was crying like a little girl who was just broken her first doll. Her sunbonnet was pushed back off her head, and tears were rolling down her face in streams. She dashed them away with her hands, kicked the pans out of the way, and flung past Grandfather, sobbing, "I won't stay here. Another cussed day. Wow. When I heard the door of her room slam, Grandfather was still shouting after her. Go off, go off, go off and see if I care. For a few seconds I thought he was going to follow her, but instead he stamped into his own room and slammed the door so hard it made the windows rattle. I didn't know just what to do. There wasn't a thing I could say to Millie that would help. If I tried to say anything to Grandfather, I'd only make matters worse. I got a screwdriver, took the broken screen door down. After I'd put it away in the carriage house attic, I unhinged and fed Nell and finished milking the brindle cow. When I started back to the house, old Bess came slowly out of the woodshed. She knew something was wrong as well as I did, but she had no better idea what to do about it. She licked my hand, looked up at me, and whined questioningly. The weather-beaten house was dark both inside and out. In the pale moonlight, it looked as though nobody lived in it. They had for generations. I didn't want to go in and sat down on the doorstone with old Bess' head in my lap. I didn't know how long I sat there, just stroking her head and thinking. The shadow of the barn peak had moved nearly across the yard before I got up and went to bed. When I did, I knew what I was going to say to Grandfather if he was still cross in the morning. Grandfather's voice was angry when he called me at 5 o'clock. He was stirring oatmeal into a kettle of steaming water when I came down to the kitchen. He didn't look up at me, but snapped, "Where's Millie at?" "I don't know," I told him. "Isn't she here?" "Of course she ain't here, or I wouldn't be asking you," he shouted. "Where's she at?" I had made up my mind the night before that I wouldn't raise my voice to Grandfather. I didn't, but I said, "Probably she's on her way to Lewiston. That's where I'd be if I were in her place." For half a minute, Grandfather stood looking at me as if he didn't believe he'd heard right. Then he blew off like an overheated boiler. After he told me to mind my manners, and called me every kind of a fool boy he could think of, he began raving about Uncle Levi. He said that between us, we'd ruined Millie till she wasn't worth a tannel whoop, that he was glad she was gone. He hoped he'd never see her again. "Who in tarnation does Levi think he be?" he shouted, writing me letters on how to run this place. He never run it, did he? Going off homesteading, leaving me here alone once I was sick of bed. Come down here and stave the buildings all to smithereens with his fool contraptions. I won't have it. I won't have it, I tell you. Father fetched this place out of the wilderness with his bare hands, and by fire, I ain't going to sit by and see it run back into the wilderness with a bunch of newfangled fool contraptions. I won't have it. I won't have it, I tell you. Now get out there and go to digging up them rocks with a potato fork like I told you to do it in the first place. After planning my speech so carefully the night before, I didn't intend to leave the kitchen till I'd made it. I tried to keep my voice quiet and steady, but it shook a little when I said, "I think I did you a good job in putting up the hay while you were sick. I spent more dressing while you were gone to the encampment than you thought I could. In 4 days, I've taken all the rocks off nearly a fifth of the high field. When you thought the job would take till snow flew. I couldn't have done any of those jobs without—" "Get out of here," Grandfather shouted, and waved the mixing spoon at me. "Get off this place before I lose my temper. Get out. Get back to Boston where Levi can spoil you some more." After getting that far, I wasn't going to stop till I'd finished. So right through Grandfather's shouting, I kept on. Without contraptions. Most of the time you knew I was using them. That's why you kept out of sight till Millie and I had the haying all done. I don't mind hard work, but I won't do useless jobs the hard way, just so I won't have time to do anything else. And I won't be yelled at all the time when I haven't done anything wrong. Wow. I've been so busy thinking about what I was going to say that until I was all through talking, I didn't realize that Grandfather had sent me home. Then I felt sort of silly. I went upstairs, changed my clothes, packed my suitcase, and left. Wow. I heard Grandfather slamming things around in the carriage house as I went out the driveway, but I didn't look back. I did look in as I went past the little hills, but I didn't see any. That's the end of that chapter. Chapter 21 will be next, hopefully either later today or tomorrow. Okay, bye-bye, everybody.